The transport shuttle's descent through Tellus 9's atmosphere felt like being swallowed by something that had already decided you weren't worth digesting properly. Cale Varden pressed his forehead against the viewport, watching lightning fork through clouds that looked like they'd been beaten into submission by the weather itself. 5 years of war had left this planet resembling a philosophical argument about entropy, technically still functional, but nobody was particularly happy about it. "Stop doing that," Ambassador Wei said from across the cabin, not looking up from her data tablet. "You'll fog the glass with your anxiety." "I'm not anxious. I'm contemplating the strategic value of ceremonial medals in close-quarters combat," Cale replied, adjusting the row of ribbons on his dress uniform. "Current assessment, minimal to none." Wei's mouth twitched in what might have been amusement if she ever allowed herself such frivolous displays during official functions. "The Ashkari appreciate military achievement. Looking like you've actually done something besides push papers will help." "I've done lots of things besides push papers. Most of them involve being shot at, which I'm told builds character." Cale glanced at the security detail seated behind them, noting how Corporal Reeves was methodically checking her sidearm, despite the fact that weapons were supposed to remain ceremonially sealed throughout the summit. "Though I suspect character isn't what the Ashkari are measuring us by." The shuttle touched down with the kind of precision that made Cale immediately suspicious of the landing systems. Nothing worked this well on Tellus 9 unless someone had recently installed it, which meant the Ashkari had brought their own infrastructure. That level of preparation suggested they were either genuinely committed to negotiations or setting up for something considerably less diplomatic. Through the viewport, he could see the reception area spreading across what remained of the planet's central plaza. Ashkari soldiers stood in formation, so perfect it looked computer-generated, their armor the color of space between stars, helmets reflecting nothing but the gray sky overhead. And at the center of it all, standing with the kind of stillness that made statues look fidgety, was Queen Sareth Valshara herself. Cale had studied her files obsessively during the 3-week journey to Tellus 9. Combat footage from 17 major engagements, tactical analyses of her strategies, psychological profiles that mostly concluded with variations of extremely dangerous, approach with caution, or preferably don't approach at all. None of it had prepared him for the reality of her physical presence. She was tall, nearly matching his own height, built like someone who decided that physics was more of a suggestion than a law and had trained accordingly. Her armor was functional rather than ornate, dark plates fitted with the precision of evolution. And her face. Well, her face was the kind of problem that had probably started wars in less enlightened eras. She could have walked through any human city without drawing more than appreciative glances, except for the ears that rose to elegant points through hair the color of midnight on a world with 3 moons. And the eyes. Definitely the eyes. They held the kind of focused intensity, usually reserved for people calculating exactly how many moves ahead they were in games everyone else had just realized they were playing. "Try not to stare," Wei murmured as the shuttle ramp began lowering. "They consider it a challenge." "Everything's a challenge with them," Cale muttered. "I sneezed during the pre-mission briefing, and the cultural liaison spent 20 minutes explaining how that might be interpreted as a declaration of territorial dominance." "Did you sneeze aggressively? Is there a non-aggressive way to sneeze?" The formal greetings were conducted in Ashkari, then rendered into Terran standard by translation software that somehow made diplomatic pleasantries sound even more tedious than they actually were. Ambassador Wei spoke about hope and mutual interests, using words that meant everything and nothing simultaneously. The Ashkari general, a man whose face looked like it had been used as a tactical planning surface for several brutal campaigns, responded with equally meaningless courtesies. Through it all, Queen Sareth said nothing. She simply watched, her gaze tracking across the Terran delegation with systematic precision. When her eyes found Cale, they stopped. The moment stretched, becoming something uncomfortable enough that he found himself mentally reviewing his emergency combat training despite being completely unarmed and surrounded by roughly 200 individuals who could kill him in increasingly creative ways. Then she smiled, just slightly, and Cale decided that maybe being shot at hadn't actually been the character-building experience he'd thought it was. The summit venue was a building that had survived the war mostly by accident, and partly because both sides had needed it for medical facilities at various points. Someone had attempted to restore it to diplomatic functionality, which meant covering the worst damage with prefabricated shielding and pretending the scorch marks were decorative features. Cale's official role was listed as military liaison, which was diplomatic code for the person we blame when everything inevitably goes wrong. The first day of negotiations proceeded with the kind of glacial progress that made geological time seem hasty. Territory disputes, resource allocation, prisoner exchanges, everything hashed out in excruciating detail, while lawyers found loopholes in agreements that didn't even exist yet. Cale stood behind Wei, maintaining an expression of attentive interest while actually wondering whether the Ashkari coffee was meant as refreshment or biological warfare. Possibly both. They seemed like the type to appreciate efficiency. Queen Sareth attended every session, seated at the head of her delegation like a particularly dangerous piece of furniture that hadn't decided whether to remain stationary or suddenly kill everyone in the room. She spoke occasionally, her voice turning Terran standard into something almost musical despite discussing topics like grain shipments and mining rights. But Cale noticed she kept glancing in his direction, quick looks that might have meant nothing or might have meant he should start updating his will. During the evening recess, as the Terran delegation gathered in their secured quarters to compare notes and contemplate the heat death of diplomatic progress, Wei pulled Cale aside with an expression that suggested she had information he wasn't going to enjoy. "The Queen asked about you," she said without preamble. Cale felt something cold and anxious take up residence in his stomach. "Asked what specifically?" "Your service record, combat experience, whether you were married." Wei's expression suggested she found this last question particularly fascinating in a way that made Cale deeply uncomfortable. "I told her you were an exemplary officer and that your personal life was your own business." She seemed amused. Amused is probably better than offended. "With the Ashkari, I'm genuinely uncertain about that." Wei studied him with the same intensity she brought to treaty negotiations. "Their culture has unusual customs regarding personal challenge and social hierarchy. If the Queen is showing individual attention to a relatively junior officer, it could mean several things, none of which are covered in standard protocols." Cale wanted to point out that very little about this situation qualified as standard, but before he could respond, alarms began shrieking throughout the compound with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for imminent catastrophic failure of life support systems. Both delegations moved with practiced efficiency toward emergency positions, security details forming defensive perimeters, while diplomats were hustled toward reinforced safe rooms. But the attack, when it materialized, wasn't external. One of the Ashkari guards had drawn a curved blade that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, advancing toward the Queen with focused intensity that spoke of either fanaticism or excellent mind control programming or possibly both. Sareth moved before anyone else could react. Her hand snapped out, catching the attacker's wrist and redirecting the blade with precision that suggested she'd been expecting exactly this flavor of betrayal. What happened next took perhaps 5 seconds, but would replay in Cale's memory with uncomfortable clarity for considerably longer. The Queen twisted, using momentum against the attacker, driving him to the marble floor hard enough to crack it. Her other hand found his throat, and there was a moment where she could have killed him, where every line of her body suggested she wanted to kill him, but instead she simply held him there until additional guards could intervene. Then she stood, breathing only slightly faster than normal, and looked directly at Kale with an expression he couldn't begin to interpret. "Tomorrow," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos with absolute clarity, "we will discuss more interesting matters than borders and trade routes." Kale, who had survived 3 years of frontier warfare and countless situations that should have killed him, felt genuinely afraid for the first time in recent memory. Not the clean fear of combat, but something more complicated, the fear of being noticed by something vastly more dangerous than yourself, and having no idea what its intentions might be. That night, he didn't sleep well. He kept thinking about pointed ears and predatory smiles, and the way the Queen had moved, like violence made elegant. He thought about the fact that she'd asked whether he was married, which seemed like an odd question for an alien monarch to pose about a random human officer. Mostly, though, he thought about how her eyes had found him after subduing the assassin, and how that look had contained something that might have been curiosity or assessment or possibly just the expression a scientist makes when encountering an interesting specimen they're considering dissecting. 3 hours before dawn, Kale gave up on sleep entirely and went through his combat exercises in the small space allocated to his quarters, trying to burn off the restless energy that came from knowing something significant was approaching without having any idea what form it would take. He had a feeling he was going to find out soon, and he had an equally strong feeling that he wasn't going to enjoy the discovery nearly as much as Queen Sareth apparently expected to. The morning arrived with all the enthusiasm of a funeral dirge played at half speed. Kale had given up on sleep around 400 hours and spent the intervening time doing push-ups until his arms shook, then reviewing tactical briefings until his brain felt equally unstable. The breakfast provided by the neutral catering service achieved a level of culinary disappointment that seemed almost intentional. Eggs that might have been synthesized from petroleum byproducts, and coffee that tasted like someone had steeped old boots in lukewarm regret. "You look terrible," Corporal Reeves observed cheerfully, sliding into the seat across from him with a tray containing identical terrible food. "Did you sleep at all, or did you spend the whole night contemplating your imminent doom?" "I contemplated many things," Kale said, attempting to make the eggs more palatable through sheer force of will. "Doom was only about 60% of it. The Queen's still watching you, by the way." Reeves gestured subtly toward the Ashkari section of the dining facility, where Queen Sareth sat among her advisors, apparently engaged in perfectly normal breakfast conversation, while somehow also maintaining direct eye contact with Kale across 50 meters of crowded room. "It's actually impressive. I've been timing her. She can hold a conversation, eat, and stare at you simultaneously. That's multitasking on a level I genuinely respect." Kale resisted the urge to look. Maybe she's just spacing out, and I happen to be in her line of sight. Sure. And maybe those aren't Ashkari special forces doing perimeter checks every 45 minutes, and this isn't the most heavily armed peace summit in recorded history, and I'm not carrying 3 concealed weapons despite the strict no-weapons policy. Reeves took a bite of something claiming to be toast. "We're all just here for the wonderful food and stimulating conversation." Ambassador Wei materialized beside their table with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested someone's day was about to get significantly more complicated. "Lieutenant Varden, you're needed in conference room 7 immediately. The Queen has called for a special session." Kale set down his fork, which was probably doing more harm than good anyway. "Special session about what?" She didn't specify. She just requested your presence by name, rank, and service number, which suggests she's either been reading your personnel file very thoroughly or someone gave her your complete dossier. Wei's expression contained layers of concern that Kale didn't have time to properly excavate. "I've consulted with every xenoanthropologist available, and none of them can tell me why an Ashkari monarch would take such specific interest in a mid-level Terran officer." "Maybe she's recruiting for her book club," Reeves suggested helpfully. I hear the Ashkari are big on literature, very into tragic poetry about honor and battle and the inevitable decay of all things. If this turns into some kind of ritual combat situation, Kale said, standing and attempting to brush non-existent wrinkles from his uniform, I want it noted that I filed 17 different objections to this assignment before we left Coalition space. Wei's expression softened slightly. You don't have to attend. I can claim diplomatic immunity, sudden illness, religious conversion to a faith that prohibits special sessions on days ending in Y. But avoiding this probably makes things worse. Conference Room 7 had apparently been the building's primary performance hall before the war, which meant it retained a theatrical quality despite the prefabricated shielding and tactical barriers. Both delegations were already present, arranged on opposite sides with careful symmetry. At the center, elevated on a platform that gave her clear view of everyone, Queen Sareth waited. She'd changed since yesterday's formal sessions. The functional armor was gone, replaced by ceremonial garments that were part diplomatic regalia and part tactical statement. Deep blue fabric, threaded with silver patterns that Kale's briefings identified as genealogical markers, indicating 17 generations of unbroken rule. Her ears rose through her hair like declarations of difference, adorned with silver rings marking combat achievements and diplomatic victories in equal measure. She was objectively the most dangerous person present. She was also, Kale had to admit, remarkably striking in the way that predatory animals are striking, all efficiency and focused purpose wrapped in aesthetically pleasing configuration. The Queen began speaking in Ashkari, her voice carrying through the hall without electronic assistance. The translation AI rendered her words with slight delay, and what it said made the entire Terran delegation go very still. We gather to witness something unprecedented in 1,000 years of Ashkari history. As your queen, I have led you through 5-star systems, brought victory where others saw only defeat, proven my right to rule through combat and strategy and absolute commitment to our people's survival. No one here would question my strength or judgment. She paused, and her eyes found Kale with targeting precision. Which is why you will understand that what I do now is neither madness nor weakness, but a test of myself, of this human, and perhaps of the future our two peoples might share. Kale felt the weight of several hundred eyes rotating toward him, most belonging to people who could kill him in ways that would require detailed technical diagrams to explain. Ambassador Wei's hand found his arm, her grip suggesting she was either offering support or preventing him from fleeing. Potentially both. Queen Sareth descended from the platform, moving with grace that made her approach seem inevitable, like watching gravity work. She stopped precisely 3 meters away, the traditional Ashkari dueling distance, and when she spoke again it was in unfiltered Terran standard. Lieutenant Kale Varden, I have watched you these past days. Studied your record, learned of your victories and defeats, understand how you think and how you fight. You are not the strongest warrior the Terran coalition could have sent, not the most decorated or experienced. She smiled, and there was something in it that might have been respect or anticipation or both. But you are interesting, and among my people, that matters more than all the medals in the universe. The scarred Ashkari general stepped forward, his expression suggesting he was reading from a script he'd never expected to actually use. By ancient law and sacred custom, marriage among the royal bloodline can be granted only through the right of dominion. A suitor must prove themselves worthy through single combat, demonstrating strength, cunning, and the will to stand as equal partner in governance of our people. Kale felt reality perform an unexpected ever survived the right when attempted against a reigning monarch. Most are dead within the first minute. Ambassador Wei had gone pale, and Kale could practically hear her mental calculations running through every possible diplomatic consequence. Refuse and the Ashkari Sea weakness summit collapses. Accept and lose, prove Terran inferiority publicly. Accept and somehow win. Actually, Kale hadn't gotten that far because the idea seemed ludicrous. He'd reviewed Queen Sareth's combat footage. She moved like violence achieved consciousness and decided to become elegant about it. He was good, certainly, had survived situations that should have killed him, won fights against superior opponents. But this was different. This was facing someone who'd been bred for combat, trained from childhood, enhanced by technologies the Coalition was still attempting to understand. And yet, the way she looked at him suggested this wasn't about proving points or humiliating the Terran delegation. There was something else in her expression, something that looked almost like hope, like anticipation, like the expectation that he might surprise her in ways her own people never could. The rite traditionally allows 3 days of preparation, the general continued, still reading from his improbable script. During this time, the challenger may train, study their opponent, prepare themselves mentally and physically for combat to come. The queen will do the same, showing no favoritism despite her personal interest in the outcome. Kale looked at Ambassador Wei, who seemed to be silently willing him to make the decision causing least diplomatic damage while simultaneously having no idea what that decision might be. He looked at the Terran delegation, seeing expressions ranging from horror to fascination to barely suppressed amusement. He looked at the Ashkari delegation, where reactions varied. Some appeared outraged, others intrigued, a few already calculating odds and placing bets. Then he looked back at Queen Sareth, at the woman who'd apparently decided the best way to advance peace negotiations was offering to marry him if he could beat her in a fight. It was insane, unprecedented, possibly the worst idea he'd encountered in a military career that had included several genuinely terrible ideas. "I accept," he heard himself say, the words emerging before better judgment could intervene. 3 days from now, I'll face you in the right of dominion." The queen's smile transformed into something that might have been genuine pleasure. "Excellent. I was hoping you'd say that. Lieutenant Varden, you have no idea how boring it's been, ruling an empire where everyone either fears me or worships me. The possibility of someone who might actually challenge me, who might stand as true partner rather than subordinate." She stepped closer, within arm's reach now, her voice dropping so only he could hear. "Win or lose, you've already given me something valuable. You've made me curious about what comes next." Then she turned and addressed the assembled crowd, her voice ringing with authority. "Let it be known that the right of dominion has been declared and accepted. 3 days hence, we will witness either the beginning of a new alliance between our peoples, or confirmation that some gaps cannot be bridged. Either way, history will remember this moment." As the hall erupted into controlled chaos, both delegations suddenly needing urgent private consultations, Kale found himself wondering whether he'd just done something incredibly brave or monumentally stupid. The two weren't mutually exclusive, but in this case, he suspected the odds heavily favored the latter. Ambassador Wei appeared at his elbow, her expression suggesting she was already composing the report explaining how her military liaison had somehow gotten himself engaged to the enemy's queen. "Well," she said quietly, "I suppose promote cross-cultural understanding through arranged combat marriage was technically within the broad parameters of your mission brief." "Very, very technically." "I'm doomed, aren't I?" Kale asked. "Almost certainly," Wei agreed. "But look on the bright side. If you somehow win, you'll be the first human to marry into alien royalty. That's worth something in the history books. And if I lose, then you'll be a footnote about the dangers of accepting personal challenges from warrior queens. Either way, you're going to be famous." Kale watched Queen Sareth move through the crowd, accepting congratulations and fielding questions with easy confidence of someone who just made a decision she knew was right despite everyone else's doubts. 3 days. He had 3 days to figure out how to survive a fight with possibly the most dangerous woman in 5-star systems. It was going to be a very long 3 days. The training facility the Ashkari had allocated for Kale's preparation looked like someone had taken a gymnasium, stripped out anything remotely comfortable, and then asked a committee of sadists to optimize it for suffering. Gray walls, harsh lighting, and equipment that appeared designed to remind users of their own mortality. Kale stood in the center of the empty space, rotating his shoulders and trying to convince himself that 3 days was plenty of time to prepare for fighting a woman who'd been killing people professionally since before he'd learned to tie his shoes. "You know," Corporal Reeves said from the doorway, carrying a duffel bag that clinked suspiciously, "most people prepare for diplomatic missions by studying cultural protocols and memorizing trade agreements. You've somehow managed to turn it into a romantic comedy where the punchline is your probable death." "I'm a trendsetter," Kale replied, beginning his warm-up stretches. "In 100 years, all diplomatic negotiations will be resolved through ritualized combat marriage proposals. They'll call it the Varden Protocol. They'll call it the Don't Do This Protocol." Reeves set down the bag and began extracting monitoring equipment. "Ambassador Wei sent me to observe your training and provide tactical analysis. Also, I think she's hoping I can talk you into faking a medical emergency and fleeing the planet in the middle of the night. That would be bad for interspecies relations. You know what else is bad for interspecies relations? Getting killed by an alien queen in front of both our delegations because you were too polite to say no." Reeves attached a biometric sensor to Kale's wrist. "I've been reviewing her combat footage. She fought a territorial dispute on Karath 4 where she personally engaged 17 enemy combatants simultaneously and walked away with minor bruising. Minor bruising, Kale, against 17 opponents. Maybe they were just really bad at combat. They were Karath shock troops. They're literally bred for violence. They have redundant organs specifically to survive longer in fights." Reeves pulled up a holographic display showing Queen Sareth's movement patterns from various engagements. "She moves like physics is optional, and she's decided to opt out." Kale watched the footage, studying the way Sareth flowed between strikes, how she anticipated attacks before they developed, the efficiency with which she ended threats. It was like watching art. If art could kill you in 17 different ways before you finished blinking. "The good news," Reeves continued with absolutely no conviction, "is that the right of dominion has specific rules. No lethal weapons, no permanent injury. Combat continues until one party yields or is rendered unable to continue. The bad news is that unable to continue covers a lot of territory between slightly winded and medically dead. You're really selling this. I'm preparing you for reality." Reeves adjusted the holographic display, bringing up anatomical data on Ashkari physiology. "They're stronger than humans' baseline, faster reaction times, denser bone structure. On paper, you shouldn't last 30 seconds. On paper, I shouldn't have survived the frontier campaigns either, but here we are." Kale began running through combat forms, letting muscle memory take over while his mind processed the tactical problem. "What about psychological factors? The Queen said I was interesting. That's got to mean something. It means you're a fascinating specimen she's looking forward to fighting." Reeves paused. Although there was something odd in the xenoanthropology reports. Ashkari royalty almost never marry outside their immediate noble class, and the right of dominion is traditionally reserved for arranged political marriages within the empire. Her using it for an alien she's known for 2 days is unprecedented. Maybe she really does find me interesting. Or maybe she's making a political statement we don't understand yet. Reeves watched Kale move through defensive sequences. "Either way, you're the person who has to not die while we figure it out." They trained for 3 hours, Reeves calling out attack patterns from the Queen's previous fights while Kale practiced counters and evasions. By the end, he was drenched in sweat, and his muscles felt like they'd filed formal complaints with his nervous system. "You're improving," Reeves said, which was corporal speak for "you're slightly less doomed than before." "I'm doomed with better form." That's the spirit. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Kale was reviewing holographic tactical simulations when one of the Ashkari guards appeared at the facility entrance, accompanied by the scarred general whose name Kale had learned translated to something like "he who remembers fallen allies," which seemed both poetic and depressing. "Lieutenant Varden," the general said in heavily accented Terran standard, "the Queen requests your presence for evening meal. Alone." Kale exchanged glances with Reeves, who looked like she was mentally calculating extraction routes and acceptable casualty rates. "Is this part of the right preparation?" The Queen did not specify her intentions. She merely requested, and when our Queen requests, we facilitate. The general's scarred face might have contained amusement. "You may refuse, of course. Though I suspect that would be unwise." 20 minutes later, Kale found himself being escorted through sections of the compound he hadn't seen before, past security checkpoints that made the Terran perimeter look like a suggestion box with aspirations. They arrived at a building that had apparently been someone's private residence before the war and had been hastily converted into temporary royal quarters. Queen Sareth was waiting in what might have once been a dining room, though the original furniture had been replaced with Ashkari equivalents. She'd changed out of her ceremonial garments into something simpler, dark fabric that still somehow managed to look regal, while being practical enough to fight in if necessary. Her pointed ears rose through unbound hair, and without the formal trappings of state, she looked younger than Kale had realized. Still dangerous, but younger. "Lieutenant Varden," she said, gesturing to a seat across from her. "Thank you for accepting my invitation. I realize this is irregular, but I find I have questions that cannot be asked in formal sessions." Kale sat carefully, noting that the chair positioned him with his back to the door, which was either a show of trust or a tactical statement. "I'm honored, Your Majesty, though I should mention that my ambassador would probably prefer I not have private meetings with foreign monarchs who have challenged me to combat." Sareth smiled. "Your ambassador strikes me as someone who prefers many things that rarely occur. The galaxy is not accommodating to preferences." She gestured to the table, where food had been arranged, Ashkari cuisine alongside what appeared to be attempts at Terran dishes. "I thought we might eat and discuss matters more openly than politics allows." The food was surprisingly good, though Kale suspected the Ashkari dishes were probably simplified for human digestion. They ate in silence for a moment before Sareth spoke again. "Why did you accept the right?" Kale had been expecting tactical questions or political maneuvering, not directness. "Honestly, I'm still not entirely sure. Part duty, part curiosity, part temporary insanity brought on by diplomatic stress. Most humans would have refused. The smart choice, the safe choice." Sareth studied him across the table. "My own advisors think I have made a mistake. They believe I should have chosen someone from our noble houses if I wished to marry, or simply remained unmarried and named an heir from my bloodline. Instead, I have challenged an alien warrior to a rite that will likely kill him. You really know how to make a person feel special." She laughed, and the sound was unexpected, genuine and unguarded. "You use humor as a defense mechanism. I have read this in your psychological profile. When faced with danger or uncertainty, you make jokes to establish psychological distance from the threat." "My psychological profile sounds like it was written by someone fun at parties." "It was written by 3 different coalition intelligence analysts and an AI behavioral prediction system. They all agree you are unconventional, difficult to predict, and statistically more likely to survive impossible situations than mathematical modeling suggests you should be." Sareth leaned forward slightly. "Do you know what I find most interesting about you, Lieutenant? My winning personality and excellent taste in combat boots. You are not afraid of me. Oh, you recognize I am dangerous. You understand I could kill you quite easily. But you are not afraid." Her expression shifted to something thoughtful. My own people fear me or worship me or both. Your people see me as an enemy to be defeated or avoided, but you look at me and see a person. A problem to be solved, perhaps, but a person nonetheless. Kale set down his utensil, meeting her eyes directly. With respect, Your Majesty, you're the one who invited me to dinner after challenging me to ritual combat. If we're discussing unconventional behavior, you've got a solid claim to the championship. The right of dominion is not merely about combat prowess. It is about finding a partner who can stand as equal, who can challenge and be challenged, who can share the burden of rule without being crushed by it. Sareth's voice carried something that might have been loneliness. I have been queen since my 17th year. I have won battles, expanded our territory, brought prosperity to my people, and I have been utterly alone in doing it. So you thought, what, I'll marry an alien I barely know, that should fix the loneliness problem. I thought, here is someone who does not fear me, who uses humor to mask tactical thinking, who has survived situations he should not have survived through innovation rather than strength. She smiled again, and this time it reached her eyes. And I thought, if he can survive 3 days of preparation without fleeing the planet, perhaps he is interesting enough to continue surprising me. They talked for another hour, conversation ranging from tactical philosophy to the nature of leadership to Kale's admission that he'd once accidentally started a diplomatic incident by mispronouncing a Vexen trade minister's name in a way that apparently meant, your mother makes questionable life choices. You will lose the right, Sareth said finally, as guards appeared to escort Kale back to the Terran compound. You understand this, yes. I am faster, stronger, trained for exactly this kind of combat since childhood. You will lose. Probably, Kale agreed. But I've lost before. I've just gotten good at losing in interesting ways. Sareth stepped closer, and for a moment Kale thought she might do something dramatic like kiss him, or declare eternal enmity, or challenge him to another right. Instead, she simply placed a hand briefly on his shoulder. 3 days from now, Lieutenant Varden, I will defeat you in combat, and then we will see what happens next. Her smile turned predatory. Win or lose, you have already made this summit infinitely more interesting than arguing about grain shipments. Walking back through the compound, Kale found Reeves waiting with an expression demanding immediate debriefing. So, she asked, did the Queen reveal any tactical weaknesses, psychological vulnerabilities, plans for the combat? She told me I'm definitely going to lose, but she appreciates my personality. Kale headed toward his quarters, suddenly exhausted. Also, I think she might actually be lonely, which is probably the saddest thing I've learned all week. You had dinner with an alien monarch who's going to fight you in 3 days, and your main takeaway is that she needs friends. I contain multitudes, Kale said. Also, impending doom. Don't forget the impending doom. 3 days evaporated like water on a hot engine core, leaving Kale standing in the center of a makeshift arena wondering how his diplomatic assignment had transformed into what amounted to sanctioned assault with an audience. The combat space had been cleared in the compound's largest courtyard, with both delegations arranged in careful formation around the perimeter. Somewhere overhead, atmospheric processors hummed against Tellus 9's failing terraforming systems, providing a mechanical soundtrack to what was either going to be the most interesting day of Kale's life or the last one. Last chance to fake appendicitis, Corporal Reeves muttered from her position in the Terran observation area. I've got a medical kit and absolutely no moral qualms about creative diagnosis. Appreciate the offer, but I think the Ashkari would notice if I suddenly developed a human-specific condition while surrounded by their medical scanners. Kale rolled his shoulders, feeling the tension coiled in every muscle. 3 days of preparation had taught him exactly one useful thing. He was going to lose this fight. The only variable was how spectacular the loss would be. Ambassador Wei appeared beside him, her expression carrying the weight of someone who'd already written several versions of the incident report and none of them ended well. Lieutenant, for the record, I want you to know that regardless of the outcome, your service to the Coalition has been exemplary. That's very kind, Ambassador. Also sounds suspiciously like something you'd say to someone about to die. I prefer to think of it as preemptive commendation. Wei's mouth twitched. Though if you somehow win this, I'm going to need you to explain to Coalition Command how our military liaison ended up married to the leader of our primary adversary. That's going to be a very long conversation. If I win, I'll be too busy being married to an alien queen to worry about paperwork. Queen Sareth entered the arena from the opposite side, and the assembled crowd went silent in a way that suggested reverence, fear, or possibly both operating simultaneously. She'd stripped down to combat. Sareth moved first, closing the distance with speed that made Kale's training look like slow-motion footage. He barely managed to deflect her opening strike, felt the impact reverberate through his arm, and immediately understood that every piece of combat footage he'd reviewed had somehow undersold how terrifyingly fast she actually was. "You are holding back," Sareth said, circling him with predatory grace. "Disappointing." "I'm strategically preserving energy," Kale replied, trying to track her movement while simultaneously not getting hit by the follow-up attack that was definitely coming. "It's different." She struck again, a combination that forced Kale into defensive postures he'd practiced obsessively for 3 days. He managed to avoid the worst of it, even landed a glancing counter that would have been impressive against a human opponent but barely registered against Ashkari physiology. "Better," Sareth acknowledged. "You are not trying to overpower me, smart. I have occasional flashes of intelligence between extended periods of questionable judgment." They circled each other, and Kale began to notice something interesting. Sareth was holding back too, not in strength but in finishing strikes. She could have ended this already, could have exploited a dozen openings in his defense, but instead she was testing him, evaluating, seeing how he adapted. The fight continued, Kale absorbing punishment that would have hospitalized him if the Queen was actually trying to cause permanent damage. He got in a few decent strikes of his own, learned to anticipate her patterns, started using the environment to compensate for his physical disadvantages. It still wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. 15 minutes in, Kale's body was informing him that it would like to file a formal complaint with management about current working conditions. 20 minutes in, he was fairly certain he'd discovered muscles he didn't know he had solely through the process of having them injured. 25 minutes in, he realized something that changed his entire approach. Queen Sareth wasn't trying to defeat him. She was trying to understand him. Every strike, every combination, every tactical adjustment. She was learning how he thought, how he adapted, whether he could function as a partner rather than a subordinate. The right wasn't about proving physical superiority. It was about proving compatibility. So instead of trying to win through tactics he didn't have, Kale did something completely irrational. He stopped defending and simply stood still. Sareth froze mid-strike, her expression shifting to confusion. "What are you doing?" "Testing a hypothesis," Kale said, breathing hard. "You said the right was about finding an equal partner, someone who could stand beside you without being crushed. But you've been queen since you were 17. You've spent your entire adult life proving you're stronger, faster, better than everyone around you. And now you're lonely because nobody can challenge you in ways that matter. This is your strategy. Psychological analysis, while I am attempting to fight you. You wanted interesting." Kale took a step forward directly into her guard. "Here's interesting. I can't beat you in combat. We both know it. I'm a decent fighter, but you're exceptional. But fighting isn't actually what you need." Sareth lowered her hand slightly. "You presume to know what I need. You need someone who looks at you and sees a person instead of a weapon. Someone who isn't afraid to tell you when you're wrong. Someone who makes you laugh when you're trying to be terrifying." Kale smiled despite his body's protests. You need someone who will have dinner with you and call your political maneuvers what they are, elaborate excuses to avoid admitting you're interested in someone. The arena had gone absolutely silent. Somewhere in the Terran delegation, Kale was certain Ambassador Wei was having a small stroke. Sareth stared at him, and for a long moment Kale thought he'd miscalculated badly and was about to experience what permanent injury meant in technical terms. Then she started laughing, a sound that transformed her entire face from predatory to genuinely delighted. "You are either brilliant or insane," she said. "I have not decided which. I'm told they're not mutually exclusive." She stepped closer, within arm's reach, her expression shifting to something softer. "The rite states that to defeat the Queen, one must prove themselves worthy of standing as equal partner. It does not specify the method of proof, must be through combat superiority. I'm really hoping you're about to reinterpret that rule in my favor." "Lieutenant Kale Varden," Sareth said loudly, addressing the assembled crowd, "has demonstrated qualities the rite was designed to test. Strategic thinking, adaptability, courage in the face of superior force, and the wisdom to know when traditional approaches fail." She turned back to him. "Also, he makes me laugh, which is rarer than you might think." The scarred general stepped forward, looking like someone whose entire worldview had just been reorganized without permission. "Your Majesty, are you declaring?" "I am declaring," the rite concluded. "Lieutenant Varden has proven himself worthy through unconventional means, which is entirely appropriate given that challenging an alien to the rite was itself unconventional." Sareth's smile turned predatory again. "Therefore, according to the laws and traditions of our people, I name him my consort. Let anyone who objects step forward now." Nobody stepped forward. The Ashkari delegation looked stunned, the Terran delegation looked confused, and Corporal Reeves looked like she was trying very hard not to laugh. "So," Kale said quietly, "are we actually married now, or is there more paperwork involved?" "There is substantial paperwork involved. Also a formal ceremony, treaty negotiations about your status, and approximately 17 different political complications we will need to address." Sareth touched his face gently, her fingers tracing his jaw. "But yes, Lieutenant Varden, we are actually married now. Do you have objections?" "Just one. You're going to need to stop calling me Lieutenant. It's going to be weird when we're having breakfast." She kissed him then, in front of both delegations, and what was probably going to become the most analyzed diplomatic moment in coalition history. It was surprisingly gentle for someone who'd been trying to fight him 30 seconds earlier. When they separated, Sareth addressed the crowd again. "Let it be known that this union represents a new alliance between our peoples. The details will be negotiated, the politics will be complicated, and I am certain many of you have concerns. But I have made my choice, and my choice stands." Ambassador Wei appeared beside them, her expression suggesting she'd moved beyond stroke territory into completely uncharted diplomatic waters. "Your Majesty, congratulations. Also, I'm going to need several hours to compose appropriate communications to Coalition Command." "Take several days if needed," Sareth said. "My new husband and I will be occupied with beginning to understand what we have created here." Later, in quarters that had been hastily upgraded from visiting officer to alien consort, Kale sat across from his new wife and tried to process the fact that he'd gone from military liaison to married royalty in less than a week. "You realize this is completely insane," he said. "I am aware." Sareth poured something that might have been wine or might have been ceremonial poison. With Ashkari beverages it was sometimes difficult to tell. "I have just bound myself politically and personally to an alien warrior who defeated me by refusing to fight. My advisors are composing resignation letters. Your ambassador is probably doing the same. Reeves thinks it's hilarious." "I like Corporal Reeves. She may visit." Sareth raised her glass. "To insanity, Lieutenant Kale Varden. May it serve us better than conventional wisdom has served our peoples." Kale raised his own glass, meeting her eyes and seeing in them the same mixture of uncertainty and hope he felt himself. To insanity, and to figuring out what comes next. They drank, and outside their quarters, two civilizations began the complicated process of adjusting to a peace treaty nobody had expected, sealed by a marriage nobody had predicted, between a warrior queen who needed someone to see her as human and a soldier who'd learned that sometimes the best way to win was knowing when to stop fighting. It wasn't the ending anyone had anticipated. But then again, Kale reflected as Sareth smiled at him across the table, the best stories rarely were.
¡Qué calor, guayo! ¡Qué calor que tengo yo! Que levante la mano como yo. ¡Oh, oh! ¡Ah, la madre! ¿Cómo que somos 400? Chicos, Twitch nos tiene en portada, amigos. Twitch nos tiene en portada, somos 400 viewers ahorita. ¡A huevo! Y subiendo, cabrón. Como debe ser. Siguiente artículo, Iván. No mames, se nota que es día del niño, cabrón. No. ¡Ay, gato! Puta madre. ¡Ay, gata tu madre! Vale, 521 y subiendo. Estamos en portada de Twitch. Twitch, muchas gracias, hermano.